أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين وصلى الله على سيدنا محمد وآله الطيبين الطاهرين. This is the second episode to our series Introduction to Rijal Studies. In the last episode, in the last lecture, we discussed the need for Ilm al-Rijal. Why is it that we're studying Ilm al-Rijal or Rijal studies? And as a brief summary, we said that the four main sources of Islamic law are the Quran, the Sunnah, Ijma', consensus, and Aql, logic. We said that the laws found in the Quran, or the legal verses in the Quran, are less than 500, almost 480 legal verses in the Quran. That doesn't mean there's 480 laws in the Quran. Those 480 legal verses, they can provide us with lots of other laws. I mean, possibly thousands of laws. But that's still not enough. That's still not enough for our legal system. Consensus, as I said, is not enough. And according to most contemporary scholars, jurists, and legal theorists, consensus is not binding. It has no authority, because even if the majority of jurists, they agreed on a law, I, as a jurist, I don't necessarily need to conform to them. Otherwise, then where's my ijtihad? Where's my derivation of Islamic laws? I have my understanding and they have their understanding. I respect the opinion of the majority, but that doesn't mean that I need to conform to them. And as for logic, we said that logic is very restricted, and there's no room for logic when it comes to acts of worship. Why is Salatul Dhuhr 4 units? And why is Salatul Subh 2 units? Logic, there's no room for logic in deciding that. The laws of Hajj, why do we go around the Kaaba and perform tawaf 7 times? And why is it clockwise? And why isn't it clockwise? Why isn't it 8 times that we go around the Kaaba? Or why isn't it 6? Why is it exactly 7? Logic has no room in acts of worship. So what's the major source of Islamic law? Hadith, the narrations. And as we said in the previous lecture, that in the ahadith, in the narrations, we do know that there are fabrications. We do know that some narrations were fabricated. So how can we discern and differentiate between an authentic narration and an inauthentic narration? We said there's a couple of ways. One of the methodology is that we expose the Quran, or we expose the hadith to the Quran. We test, it's like a litmus test. We see, is the hadith compatible to the Quran or is it not compatible? 2, is it compatible to logic or is it incompatible to logic? And one of the ways is to look at the chain of narrators, and we study each one of them, each one of those names. Are they credible or are they not credible? And hence, Ilm al-Rijal provides us with the general principles to test the authenticity and credibility of the individual narrators. And I believe this is where we left off, and there's lots of scholars, lots of jurists that have mentioned in their books, and specifically in usul al-fiqh, in Islamic legal theory, that a jurist has to have a mastery of ilm al-rijal in order to be a jurist. If a jurist does not master ilm al-rijal and cannot differentiate between an authentic and an inauthentic narration, then he cannot be a jurist. How is he going to derive a law? You can't consider all the narrations authentic. That's not possible. So he has to have a mastery of ilm al-rajal. This is where we left off in our last episode. Now, Rijal studies has faced a lot of opposition from various groups, from various scholars, from within the Shi'i school of thought. It wasn't agreed upon by all jurists that ilm al-Rijal is necessary. No. The major trend was that. But there were other trends as well where ilm al-Rijal was rejected and was not only seen as not necessary, unnecessary for ijtihad. Some even saw ilm al-Rijal as an existential threat to Shi'i thought and to ijtihad, as we will come back to later. One opinion says that we don't need ilm al-Rijal. Why? Because any narration, whether it has a weak chain of narrators or a strong chain of narrators, we have to see, was this narration accepted by the majority of scholars, especially the early scholars like Shaykh al-Saduq, Shaykh al-Tusi, al-Kulayni, al-Mufid, Ibn al-Barraj, Ibn Hamza. These are what we call the scholars of the formative period. The formative period of the Shia school of thought. These were the scholars that formed Shi'ism and made it into a madhab school of thought. I mean, we had the Imams and we had the teachings of the Imams, but those who gathered these teachings and made them formally in a madhab, in a school of thought, it was these scholars in the formative period. So one theory says that we have to study the different narrations, but we don't look at the chain of narrators. The chain of narrators is not important. We look at the content of the narration. The scholars of the formative period, did they accept these narrations? And did they issue fatwas based upon them? Or no? Any narration that was accepted by the scholars of the formative period, by the jurists of the formative period, that narration we will consider authentic. And any narration, even if it has a weak chain of narrators, and any narration that the early jurists, that the jurists of the formative period, like al-Saduq, al-Mufid, al-Kulayni, al-Tusi, and others, they rejected, we will also reject, even if it has a strong chain of narrators. So, if the narration here, it's categorized in ilm al-Rijal as da'if and has a weak chain of narrators, but the jurists from the formative period, they acted upon it, they accepted it, they based a fatwa on it, we take. And if a narration that is categorized as sahih in ilm al-Rijal, but the jurists in the formative period, they rejected, we reject as well. And this theory was called Jabiriyat Amal al-Mashhur, that the jurists of the formative period, if they acted upon a narration, even if it's weak, their acting upon it makes it strong. I know this it becomes a long sentence, but in Arabic, the narration, the theory is called Jabiriyat Amal al-Mashhur. Based upon this theory, there's no need for ilm al-Rijal. There's no need to come and study the chain of narrators. Let the narration be weak. But if the scholars of the formative period, they acted upon this hadith, that's it. Let the chain of narrators be strong. They're all credible sources. But if the hadith was rejected by the early scholars, then we reject the hadith. So what's the point of ilm al-Rijal? This was a theory. And this theory existed. It was a prominent theory. And There were several scholars that accepted this theory. Sayyid al-Khoi, who date of death is 1992, Sayyid al-Khoi came and rejected this theory. And that is why we see during the time of Sayyid al-Khoi, there was a revival for Ilm al-Rijal. Ilm al-Rijal was dying out. Sayyid al-Khoi came and revived Ilm al-Rijal by rejecting this theory. He said, no, this theory has absolutely no basis. So what if the early jurists during the formative period, they took a stand from a narration, whether they accepted or rejected? That is their ijtihad. That is their understanding. And I'm a mujtahid myself. It's just like saying, doctors 1,000 years ago, they used to perform surgeries that way. And so today, I have to see this surgery or this medicine, would it be accepted by the early doctors or not? If it was, then I'll accept this medicine. If it wasn't, I'll reject it. Well, then why did you study to become a doctor? Why did you go through all that trouble? You just go read the study of medicine and see what was accepted and what was rejected. Sayyid al-Khoi says jurists are like doctors. Just like a doctor has his own understanding and doesn't need to conform to other doctors, a jurist of Islamic law is the same. He has his own understanding. He has to look at the sources, the Quran, the Sunnah, the narrations, impartially, unbiasedly. He should not be affected by other people's understanding. He should not feel pressured to accept a narration or to reject a narration just because it was accepted by the jurists of the formative period. He has to look and study the narration impartially and look at its chain of narrators. And this theory makes a lot of sense. And hence, Sayyid al-Khoi was able to revive Ilm al-Rijal, bring it back to the spotlight, and say that we do need to study the chain of narrators. We have to see if the chain of narrators is authentic or it's not authentic. We shouldn't care whether scholars of the formative period accepted a narration or did not accept a narration. As opposed to the school of thought of Sayyid al-Burujurdi. Sayyid al-Burujurdi lived in Qom, Iran, before the time of Sayyid Hossein Al Hakim. I'm not exactly sure of the date of death. I am assuming in the 1960s. In the 1960s. Or possibly even 1950s. 1950s, 1960s. Sayyid al-Burujurdi was in Qom, and he has a lot of students. One of his students is Sayyid al-Sistani. Sayyid al-Burujurdi says, no, we have to look at the formative period and what the jurists believed and accepted during the formative period. Why? Because it was this period where they received everything from the imams. These were the early jurists, the formative period, right after al-Ghaybat al-Sughra, the minor occultation. These scholars, they came right at the beginning of al-Ghaybat al-Kubra, the major occultation. So the imam had just disappeared. These scholars, they began to form Shi'ism. They began to collect the narrations of Ahlul Bayt and their teachings and their principles, and they formally formed a madhab, school of thought. These scholars, when they accept a narration or they reject a narration, it's not based on their ijtihad. It's not based on their understanding. It's based on what they received generation after generation of scholars, of the companions of Ahlul Bayt, until it reached them. So basically, it reached them from the Ahlul Bayt directly. So when they say we accept this narration, basically it portrays the position of the imams regarding this narration. And when they reject the narration, that's basically the imam rejecting that narration. This is according to Sayyid al-Burujurdi. Now you see how it gets complicated, and there's two schools of thought. Now if I could put my 2 cents, I would say, okay, let's, hypothetically speaking, let's agree with Sayyid al-Burujurdi and say that the scholars of the formative period, their stance, their position from a narration is important. So if they accept the narration, we should accept it and not even pay attention to the chain of narrators. And if they reject the narration, we should also reject it even if the chain of narrators is authentic. How many narrations were accepted by the scholars of the formative period? And when I say accepted by the by the scholars of the formative period, I mean collectively. I mean all of them. There was a consensus among them to accept the narration. How many narrations were accepted by those scholars collectively? Meaning there's an ijma', there's a consensus. There was a consensus by the scholars of the formative period to accept a specific narration. How many narrations can we say had that quality? 100? 200? And how many narrations were rejected by the scholars of the formative period collectively? How many? 100? Another 200? That's 400 narrations that were accepted and rejected by the scholars of the formative period. Well, what about all the other narrations? We have in Al-Kafi, he lists 16,000 narrations. What do we do with the thousands of other narrations? Let's say not 400, let's say 1,000 narrations. 500 were accepted by the early scholars, and 500 were rejected by the early scholars. We don't need to study their chain of narrators. Hypothetically speaking, let's accept this theory. Of course, it wasn't just the theory of Sayyid al-Burujurdi, but he was a major defender of this theory. As a result, we'll accept 1,000 narrations. Well, what about 15,000 other narrations? What are we going to do with those narrations? We're going to have to refer to Ilm al-Rijal. These 1,000, because 500 of them were accepted by the early scholars, we'll accept. 500 of them were rejected, we'll reject. But what is our stance regarding 15,000 other narrations? We need to refer to Ilm al-Rijal. This is one. So I said I'm going to put my 2 cents. This is one. 2, how do we know that the early jurists, they took a position from these narrations? You see, these early jurists, many of them, some of them, they have books of hadith where they'll narrate narrations. And some of them just have books of fatwas, merely books of fatwas. How do we know that they relied on this narration? How do we know? In many of their books, they don't say. They just give a fatwa. And for example, they give a fatwa that eating a rabbit is haram. A dead rabbit meat. Hypothetically speaking, that rabbit meat is haram. I don't know who would want to eat rabbit meat, but I'm just giving an example here, so bear with me. And there is maybe 5 narrations, 6 narrations that say eating rabbit meat is haram. Well, this early scholar, he relied on which of these ahadith? There's one of them that he relied on, and that one does not need to be checked out when it comes to Ilm al-Rijal. We don't need to check out its chain of narrators. That narration is authentic. But which one is it? There's 6 of them, there's 5 of them, there's 10 of them. I don't know. This makes the process even more difficult. Thus, theoretically, it might, this theory might sound attractive, that any narration that was accepted by the early jurists, we will accept, and any narration that was rejected by the early jurists, we will reject. Jabariyyat Amal al-Mashhur. And even till today, there are some that reject Ilm al-Rijal based upon this narration. Specifically, the school of Qom and the school of Sayyid al-Burujudi, some will come in, reject the need for ilm al-rijal based on this. Some from the school of Sayyid al-Burujudi, not all. For example, Sayyid al-Sistani or Sayyid al-Shubayri Zanjani, these are two scholars from the school of thought of Sayyid al-Burujudi, from the school of Sayyid al-Burujudi, and they are his students, yet they still take ilm al-rijal very seriously. But the problem is, it's not going to fix our problems. It's not going to be able to fix or examine all the narrations. The narrations that the scholars accepted or rejected, there are few. We'll have a vast majority that remain to be unsolved, and we will have to refer to ilm al-rijal when it comes to those narrations. So, this theory does not help in rejecting ilm al-rijal. It does not need to, it doesn't remain as an obstacle when it comes to ilm al-rijal. Now there's another theory, and this theory was promoted by the Akhbari school of thought. We had a trend in the Shi'i school of thought called the Akhbari school, Al-Madrasa Al-Akhbariyya. And these scholars, this trend existed, I would say, from 500 to 300 years ago. Mainly in Bahrain, in the eastern province of Saudi Arabia, and even here in Iraq. In fact, even here in Karbala, where I'm sitting. Karbala became the capital for the Akhbari school of thought. Akhbaris, they have specific ideas, specific principles. I mean, the Akhbari school of thought, it could be categorized within specific principles, but the main principle is that the 4 books of hadith, and I mean Al-Kafi, من لا يحضره الفقيه, التهذيب, and Al-Istibsar. These 4 books, everything in them is authentic. So Al-Kafi, which has 16,000 narrations, everything in it is authentic. من لا يحضره الفقيه by Shaykh al-Saduq, it has 6,000 narrations. Everything in it is authentic. Al-Tahdhib or Al-Istibsar by Shaykh al-Tutsi, it has 5,000 narrations. Everything in it is authentic. This is the Akhbari claim. This is the Akhbari theory regarding our books of hadith. They say, we don't need ilm al-rijal. In fact, they say everything that is in these 4 books is authentic, and we know for a fact that they were stated by the Imams, by the Ahlul Bayt. In fact, ilm al-rijal is an existential threat to the teachings of Ahlul Bayt. Because based upon ilm al-rijal, you will accept some narrations and you will reject other narrations. Ilm al-rijal will cause you to reject some of the words of Ahlul Bayt. And that is very dangerous, because that means you'll be rejecting the teachings of Ahlul Bayt. And on the Day of Judgment, you will be held accountable, Yawm al-Qiyamah. Why did you reject the narrations of Ahlul Bayt? Thus, we have to reject ilm al-rijal, this methodology of accepting narrations based on the authenticity of the chain of narrators. This has to be rejected. Ilm al-rijal must be fought, must be rejected. Why? Because if we incorporate ilm al-rijal, we will reject some narrations and we'll accept some narrations. While we know for a fact that all of the narrations in the books of hadith, in the 4 major books of hadith, Al-Kafi, من لا يحضره الفقيه, Al-Tahdhib, and Al-Istibsar, these hadith were all stated by the Ahlul Bayt, and they're all authentic. Now, the Akhbari school of thought reached its climax in power and in influence here in Karbala at the hands of Sheikh Yusuf al-Bahrani. approximately 200, 250 years ago. It reached its climax of power and strength and influence. At the same time, a scholar by the name of Al-Wahid Al-Bahbahani, he migrated and he came to Karbala solely to combat the school of thought of the Akhbari school of thought. And he came and he proved to them that not everything in the four books is authentic. Some of the narrations are authentic and some narrations are not authentic. Now, what were their arguments? We have to be fair and objective and see what were the arguments used by the Akhbari school of thought to prove the authenticity of everything in the four books. Al-Hurr al-Amili, the author of Wasa'il al-Shi'a, which is a 30-volume compendium of a collection of the narrations of Ahl al-Bayt, which is basically a summary of Al-Kafi, من لا يحضر الفقيه, التهذيب, and Al-Istibsar. He gathered them, but what he did was he broke down the narrations into chapters. So first, the chapter on Salah, all the narrations on Salah, he gathered from the four books and he put them there with the chain of narrators. And he says, I took this hadith from which book? Is it from Al-Kafi? Is it from من لا يحضر الفقيه? And then a chapter on Tahara, a chapter on fasting, a chapter on Hajj, and so on and so forth. In the final volume of Al-Wasa'il al-Shi'a, Al-Hurr al-Amili, he designates the last volume to mention his sources and how did he take narrations from his sources, on which copies did he rely on. Because at that time those books were not published. They were transcribed. They were transmitted orally, and you would have to write your own copy. So there were a lot of copies of those books, and some of those copies maybe had mistakes. So he had to mention his sort of, how did he receive this copy? What was his chain of narrators for this copy? Anyhow, Al-Hurr al-Amili, in the last volume, he mentions 5 proofs and evidence that the books of hadith, the 4 main books of hadith, are authentic, and they do not need to be, we don't need to study and examine their chain of narrators, and we don't need to refer to their chain of narrators. We don't need to refer to ilm al-Rijal whatsoever. The first proof, basically, he says that our scholars and our ulama, when they wrote their ahadith and books of narrations, the 4 books of ahadith, they are themselves are compilations of smaller books of hadith, as I mentioned in the earlier lecture. There were 400 books of hadith, al-usul al-400, 400 small booklets of hadith, and Al-Kafi was compiled out of those 400. Min la yahdhur al-faqih, it was compiled out of those 400, but different collections. So Al-Kafi took some narrations, Min la yahdhur al-faqih took another. Al-Hurr al-Amili, he claims that the authors of those 400 books, they wrote them very carefully, they were very precise, they took their job very seriously, they didn't incorporate any narrations that they felt were weak, and they came and they showed their books to the Imams themselves. And the Imams, they confirmed, is this book authentic or is it not authentic? And then those small books, the 400 books, it reached the 3 major authors, Al-Muhammadun al-Thalath, the 3 Muhammads, Muhammad al-Kulayni, Muhammad al-Tusi, Muhammad ibn Babawayh al-Qummi, and Shaykh al-Saduq. And they gathered those ahadith. Those ahadith that were compiled in books by authors that took their jobs very seriously and they showed their books to the imams and the imams confirmed them, those hadith ended up in the 4 books of hadith. So why come and refer to Ilm al-Rijal? We know for a fact that these hadith are authentic. But this is incorrect. Why? For the following reasons. Number one, we don't know for a fact that the authors of those 400 booklets of hadith, they came and they showed the imams what they wrote. Yes, some of them did. Maybe 2, 3, 4 of them they did. They came and showed the imams, and the imams, they, they confirmed everything in the book. But not all of them did. This is a claim by Al-Hurr Al-Amili that requires evidence. Who says that all of them came and showed their books to the imams? 2, just because they took their jobs seriously, it doesn't mean that everything in their books is authentic. Doctors take their job seriously, but does that mean they don't make a mistake? Pilots take their job seriously, but does that mean that they don't crash every once in a while or they don't perform a mistake? And also, and this is very important, those 400 books, they had copies. It's not like the original reached, for example, Al-Kulayni. There were copies. Now, let's say even if the original was perfect, but what about the copies? The copies weren't perfect. Remember, the copies, there weren't publishing homes at that time, publishing houses. There were narrators that would come, they'd look at the original and they'd write, they'd copy. And a lot of times they'd make mistakes. They'd add a word, they'd subtract a word, or you know how you're looking at one line and then your eye goes to another line and completely make a mistake. How can we rely on those copies? Don't we need a chain of narrators to that copy? An authentic source, a chain of narrators, an authentic chain of narrators that says we relied on this copy. How else can you rely on a copy if it was not transmitted by a reliable source? Someone credible, narrated from another person that was credible, that narrates from a third person that was credible, this hadith. So, just because they took their job seriously and some of them showed their books to the imams, it doesn't mean that all of them did the same. We will stop here at the first evidence that Al-Hurr Al-Amili showed, and obviously we did not accept this evidence, and in the next lecture we will continue where we left off, inshaAllah. Walhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen, wa sallallahu ala Muhammadin wa alihi at-tahirin.